right, today we're going to be discussing Ecology, section 2.3, and if you're following along with your book, that's on page 45 in your book, and this is on the cycling of matter. So how are essential nutrients cycled through the world? Okay. How do nutrients move through the biotic and the abiotic parts of an ecosystem? And when we get done with section 2.3, you should be able to describe how the nutrients move through the biotic and abiotic parts of an ecosystem and explain the importance of the nutrients to living organisms. Okay. So, following along, first of all, there are many cycles in the biosphere. Energy is transformed into usable forms to support the functions of an ecosystem. So nutrients and different forms of matter will cycle through an ecosystem. So everything gets recycled and reused. And probably one of the easiest ways to see that you've been familiar with since you were young is through the water cycle. The water cycle is a very simple cycle that you are probably very familiar with. And what you have happening here is, of course, water that is contained within lakes and oceans and rivers and streams is evaporated or transpired from plants and put into the atmosphere, where it then falls back to Earth as precipitation in the form of rain and snow. From there, of course, it's soaked up by the plants, and the plants put it back into the atmosphere, or the precipitation refills oceans and lakes where it gets evaporated again. Some of the water is contained locked up within groundwater underneath the soil, and of course that water will eventually be pumped out and used, and it gets into the ground as it rains and water seeps into the ground. But all of it is continually recycled through evaporation and precipitation and transpiration. Water is a continuous cycle. And that's where our water comes from, is throughout the water cycle. Now, approximately 90% of the water vapor evaporates from ocean, lakes, and rivers. So almost all of the water that is up in the troposphere, in the atmosphere, comes from those ocean, lakes, and rivers. Another 10% will evaporate from the surface of plants, and that's the process of transpiration. Fresh water is actually a very small portion of the Earth. Only about 3% of all water on Earth is fresh, and about 69% of all fresh water is found in the ice caps and the glaciers. But just like everything else, the water cycle is continuous. Water on the ground evaporates and becomes water vapor in the atmosphere that eventually condenses and comes back down to Earth. Or, in some cases, the water is taken back up by the plants and transpires from the plants to get back into the atmosphere. Okay. So this is the abiotic cycling of an ecosystem that directly affects the biotic factors. Now, the carbon and oxygen cycles, the carbon cycle is something we talk a lot about when we're discussing pollution, because carbon is something that contributes to the greenhouse effect, which traps gases near the surface of the atmosphere and heats up the planet. Okay. Now, how does carbon get into the atmosphere? Well, animals give off carbon dioxide, plants give off carbon dioxide through respiration. And then we also give off carbon through factory emissions, cars, industry, homes. All of those things put carbon into the atmosphere. Carbon will then be in the soil. Plant roots respire into the soil and put carbon into the soil. Dead animals and waste puts carbon into the soil. There are certain plants that actually take carbon and put it into the soil. Okay. A lot of it is from the dead and decaying organisms and root respiration as well. So the carbon cycle, the problem that we run into when we talk about things like the greenhouse effect and why we have too much carbon comes from that factory emissions and cars and homes and people that are putting too much carbon into the atmosphere, and then we don't have enough plants and things to take it out of the atmosphere, because plants will take the carbon out of the atmosphere. Okay, so again, a continuous cycle, a very continuous cycle of carbon as it cycles throughout the entire atmosphere. Carbon and oxygen often make up the molecules that are essential for life, and they recycle relatively quickly through living organisms. Because carbon is a byproduct of respiration, therefore, when carbon is taken up by organisms, it's quickly given back off into the atmosphere. So an animal eats a plant and it breathes out carbon dioxide and returns it to the atmosphere. And so it's a pretty quick cycle that happens quite often because of the whole concept of breathing, and that carbon is a byproduct of respiration. So it's a fairly quick cycle that takes place. The nitrogen cycle is one of very huge importance because all of the lower level organisms, the producers at the bottom of the triangle, they're all very dependent upon nitrogen as a fertilizer. So our atmosphere is largely nitrogen. So we can get nitrogen into the soil just from rain and snow and lightning and those types of things. Put nitrogen back into the soil, which is wonderful. There are actually even plants that will put nitrogen back into the soil. They have bacteria that grow on their roots that turn nitrogen from the air into nitrogen in the soil. Animal waste also puts a great deal of nitrogen into the soil. So nitrogen being in the soil is very important for producers so that they can grow and develop, and that higher order heterotrophs and things have something to consume. So this process of converting nitrogen into a usable form is called nitrogen fixation. So nitrogen that's in the atmosphere is not usable by plants. So the rain and the snow bring the nitrogen to the soil, and there has to be bacteria and decomposers and fungi in the soil that will turn that into a usable form of nitrogen. But again, a continuous cycle. So animals eat the plants that are dependent upon the nitrogen. Animal waste put the nitrogen back into the soil, and the cycle continues over and over again. So nothing has an ending point. Whether it's the water cycle or the carbon cycle or the nitrogen cycle, there is no ending point per se. Everything just keeps getting recycled over and over again. Okay, so nitrogen enters the food web when plants absorb nitrogen from the soil, and consumers get nitrogen by eating plants or animals that contain nitrogen. And nitrogen can get into the soil by way of the rain and the snow, because of fertilizers we put there. So there are numerous ways that we can get nitrogen into the soil. Nitrogen can return to the soil, as I just said, in several ways. Animals urinate, organisms die. Organisms will convert ammonia into usable nitrogen compounds. And then denitrification, and that's that process I was talking about of bacteria and fungi that live in the soil that can convert things into usable nitrogen, and we call that nitrogen denitrification. The phosphorus cycle is another one of those important elements. It's essential for growth and development of all organisms. A large amount of phosphorus is found in your bones and in your teeth. This is a very important cycle because it's one of those minerals that's hard to get from just eating natural things. So even though it's very important, it is in short supply when you look at that. So soil or phosphorus is cycled from the soil to the producer, and then from the producer to the consumer. And those things are pretty standard. You get some phosphorus in organisms when they die and decay, or they have waste products. And then long term, the weathering of erosion and rocks can put phosphorus back into the soil, and that will very slowly add phosphorus to the soil. The phosphorus cycle, again, is very important because it's a factor that limits growth. It's one of those key minerals that it's hard to come by but essential for growth, so it needs to be there. So the phosphorus cycle is very important. So the big thing is, that the animal waste put the phosphorus back into the soil and into the plants, and decomposers that break down dead organisms will help to put some phosphorus back into the short-term phosphorus cycle. Long-term is when we can have weathering of rocks and minerals that contain a lot of phosphorus and break them down. So the four most important cycles in the biosphere are water, carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. And these are key for biotic and abiotic. These are abiotic factors of which biotic organisms are very dependent upon. As we just talked about with the phosphorus cycle, when an organism dies, the decomposers like bacteria and fungi will return phosphorus to the soil. And then phosphorus gets eroded out of rocks and minerals, and that goes into the soil and the groundwater. And then that gets reused by the plants and the animals so that they can grow and develop. So cycles are very important, and they are a key part of the biosphere. We've covered that, and thank you very much.